Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Again, we're going to start off in the area of Bakhmut. We continue to see Russian success, Russian advances towards now the western part of the city, and now quite possibly the penetration of the final defensive belt that the Ukrainians have set up along the main railway line into the city. So again, if we go back and we look at what has happened over the last few days, we have seen the situation rapidly deteriorate for Ukrainian forces. For quite some time, the Ukrainians were holding this line. Again, that runs on the eastern portion of the city along this river feature here that runs, again, just to the east of the city. And there was a fairly significant defensive belt the Ukrainians had set up and were disallowing Russian forces, especially these Wagner units, to cross into what would be essentially the administrative portion of Bakhmut. Now, obviously, things have changed radically over the last few days. We don't know if it's because the Ukrainians have been steadily trying to get its troops out of Bakhmut, while not officially announcing that. But that is right now the case in terms of what's happening on the ground, with the Russians continuing to advance deeper and deeper into Bakhmut. And we're going to kind of go back from March 28th, 29th, 31st, April 1st, April 2nd, April 3rd, April 4th, and then kind of where we're at now. So again, we continue to hear Ukrainian leadership talking about that they are going to get Ukrainian forces out of Bakhmut if they feel that those forces are encircled. The problem with that is those forces are encircled. There are Russians to the south, there are Russians to the north, there are Russians to the east and southeast and northeast as well. And they may not have vehicles on the ground actually blocking these main highways out of Bakhmut, in these fields out of Bakhmut, but they do have a lot of artillery and they do have aircraft. And that is what is preventing Ukrainian forces from conducting an orderly withdrawal from Bakhmut. It'll be interesting to see as the Russians continue to clean up areas in the eastern portion of the city and then finally start to focus on the western portion. Will the Ukrainians be there? Are they able to get their forces out? Again, just very, very difficult to say at this time. But again, as I've talked about before, if I was the commanding general in charge of operations in Bakhmut, I would be concerned. Again, this is not the type of predicament that you want your forces to be in right now. Again, Russians to the north, Russians to the south, Russians to the east, and a very narrow ability to get out of this area, while all the while you're being subject to large volumes of artillery fire, cruise missile fire, and then obviously ballistic missile fire and aircraft as well. Difficult situation. Now, additionally, we continue to hear reports about the Ukrainians preparing for some sort of operation. It does appear that there is some sort of buildup occurring near Orkiv in this area here. We'll move over to the deployment map, where you can kind of see what is happening with the Ukrainian brigades that are building up in this area, and then quite possibly Ukrainian brigades that are deployed elsewhere in Ukraine, either undergoing refit and or training. Possibly units from Western Europe are now being sent into this area as well. for a possible operation that is going to see Ukrainian forces. I think their intent, at least, is to drive towards Melitopol. Now, that's going to be a very tough situation for Ukrainian forces if they choose that route. Ideally, you would think that they would be looking at a broad scope operation across the entire line of contact along the south, running from Zaporizhia all the way to the east towards Vuhledar. Now, that, at least on the surface, does not appear to look like what the Ukrainians, are doing. It looks like they're building up again near Orikhiv, and their main effort may be in a direction towards Melitopol. Now, the problem with that, let's go over to the deployment map. I'll give you a better idea of what we're looking at here. So if the Ukrainians do decide to launch a narrow front operation from basically Zaporizhia, Orikhiv, towards Melitopol, and let's say they do have some sort of success in which they're able to push Russian forces deeper into Zaporizhia Oblast towards Melitopol. Now, undoubtedly, they are going to create a salient that is going to run from Ukrainian-held territory down to Russian-held territory, unless they're able to conduct this broad front of operations to push en masse south. And it doesn't look like they're setting up their forces to do that as of yet. It looks like they're possibly going to try a smaller operation again in the direction of Melitopol. Now, the problem again is if they create that salient, they're going to be facing Russian forces that are going to be in the west. There's still Russian forces, Russian airborne forces, Russian ground forces, Russian National Guard forces here in Kherson. We don't believe there is a overt threat by Ukrainian forces to cross the Dnieper River at this point. You have Russian forces in Crimea, large amounts of Russian forces in Crimea, to include the 42nd Motorized Rifle Division and the 205th Motorized Rifle Brigade, among other units as well. We have reserve units of Russian forces that are moving into the Crimea as well. So if the Ukrainians do launch this anticipated offensive, push towards Melitopol, again, they're going to be facing forces to their south, to their west, and then to their east as well. And I don't see how this is going to be a successful operation for Ukrainian forces. Again, that could change on the ground, and we could see additional Ukrainian units move in, and we could see the possibility of a broad front operations, again running from Donetsk all the way towards the Dnieper River and Zaporizhia. That seems to be the most ideal if they have that capability to do it. Now, the question is do the Ukrainians have the equipment and the manpower to launch such a large-scale operation to sever this land corridor to the Crimea? And if it fails, and right now, I believe that based on the simple fact that the Russians continue to have air superiority, meaning the Russians are not flying over Ukraine or Western Ukraine per se, but they do have the ability to direct combat aircraft in the areas that they control. They do still possess, the Russians possess large quantities of heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, the same that we are seeing in the east and the eastern Donbass, will be deployed against these Ukrainian forces in these open fields in Zaporizhia as they try to, again, in all probability, sever this land corridor. I think right now the Ukrainians are looking for some sort of coup de grace, some sort of large operation to really, in their view, hurt the Russians and show their Western allies, the United States, other European nation states, that they have the ability to kick the Russians out of areas that the Russians are now in. Now, if that doesn't succeed and they sustain huge amounts of casualties, obviously the West is going to reevaluate how this war is being fought, and also have to look at, is all this equipment, all this money that is being spent on the Ukrainians worth it? But again, we are seeing the buildup of Ukrainian forces in this area. If you look over here in this area, very interesting to see this massing of Ukrainian brigades. And in all likelihood, they are conducting training operations and buildup operations for quite possibly a move across the Dnieper River. I don't think this force is going to be moved towards the Dnieper River in the south and conduct a river crossing operation against these dug-in Russian forces. I think that would be incredibly risky. But let's have a look at the buildup of these Ukrainian forces that are located just to the west of Kremenchuk, and just to the west of the Dnieper River in central Ukraine. And this is a very large force that is the 118th Mechanized Brigade, the 116th Mechanized Brigade, the 117th Mechanized Brigade, the 88th Mechanized Brigade, the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, and then finally the 13th Jager Brigade. So the question is, where are these 6 brigades going to go? This is a fairly large force that could be augmented by additional units elsewhere in Ukraine. But it looks like, at least right now, the Ukrainians are planning something, again, just to the south of Zaporizhia, within the vicinity of Orikhiv. And again, quite possibly, their goal is to make a move against that land corridor in the area near Crimea. And ultimately, that would be seizing control of Melitopol. It would be seizing control or threatening to push south towards Mariupol, Berdyansk, and again, at that point, hypothetically, if we do see a successful Ukrainian push that threatens Melitopol, that threatens Mariupol, that threatens Berdyansk down here, and lines up Ukrainian forces on the border with Crimea, I firmly believe that the Russians may use tactical nuclear weapons. I don't believe the Russians are going to allow these areas to fall into the hands of Ukrainian forces. Now, are the Russians going to have to use tactical nuclear weapons? Again, all of this idea of putting Ukrainian forces on the border of Crimea is for naught if they are defeated near Orikhiv, if they are defeated near Volhodar, if they are unable to make any headway and take significant losses. This is going to kind of create that new or that continued dynamic of this war of attrition until we see the Russian counteroffensive. And again, I don't believe that's going to happen until late summer, and quite possibly we could be looking at both dual offensive operations by both sides, depending on where we're looking at. We are seeing the massing of Ukrainian forces. We're seeing the massing of Russian forces. So in all likelihood, the ferocity and tempo of this conflict is going to pick up to a level that we may have not even seen yet, given all the forces. Again, the Ukrainian army continues to mobilize. Again, we're probably looking at about 1 million men, Ukrainian forces that have been mobilized. We're probably looking at between 800,000 upwards to 1 million Russian troops too. This is an incredibly large war that is taking place right now. And if you go back to my earlier videos predating the initial invasion by Russia, I've discussed that this could get incredibly nasty. and could be incredibly long, as both forces have the ability to field very large armies. And you compound that with the support that the Ukrainians are getting from the West, especially intelligence, direct support, direct training support, direct infusion of weapons, direct infusion of ammunition. That's what's keeping this war going. In all probability, if the West hadn't provided so much support, this probably is looking a little different than it looks right now, and especially the intelligence support that was handed over by Western nation states to the Ukrainians. It was immensely helpful to prevent some Russian successes in many areas. The West providing intelligence has caused Russia some fairly heavy losses in some of these engagements by telling the Ukrainians exactly where the Russians were, what they were going to do, and then allowing Ukrainian forces to position themselves to counter that offensive op by the Russian forces. But it will be very interesting again to see what is going to happen in the coming weeks and just a couple of months into the future. Again, this thing could get much, much more messier than what we're seeing right now. And if for some reason there is a breakthrough of Ukrainian forces that threaten Crimea, again, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, you cannot eliminate that. The Russians are not going to lose Crimea, and I don't believe they're going to lose the land bridge to Crimea. That would be an incredible, incredible upset for the Russian Federation to lose this territory and put them in a position that could be untenable unless they use tactical nuclear weapons. Now, are we going to get to that phase? Are the Ukrainians going to be successful? Difficult to say at this point. Very, very difficult. But the Ukrainians are at least telegraphing and saying right now, look, we may talk to Russia once we are on the border of Ukraine. Once we are on the border of Crimea. That may be the point where the Ukrainians are open to discussions with Russia. But at that point, if the Ukrainians are conducting those type of operations and having that type of success, this is going to just spiral out of control. And again, I firmly believe at some point, especially if the Ukrainians threaten Crimea, the Russians are going to use nuclear weapons. They're not going to allow the Ukrainians to retake Crimea. I don't think they're going to allow the Ukrainians, at least conventionally, to retake the land corridor, these areas here in Zaporizhia, Melitopol, Berdyansk, north of Mariupol, just to the south of Volhodar. Again, we're seeing the buildup of Russian forces that could be flexed into this area fairly quickly. And again, it would be very heavy fighting, very large-scale fighting, but ultimately the Russians are going to be able to field more equipment and more manpower and make it very, very difficult for successful Ukrainian conventional successful operations in this area. They may launch this offensive. They may take some ground. But ultimately, is the success going to be measured in severing the land corridor? And I think ultimately that's what they're going to try to do, and or push the line of contact further south where they can shell Russian forces with HIMARS and other systems that the West has handed over. But again, at some point, Russian forces are going to continue to mobilize and look to offensive operations elsewhere to possibly require Ukrainian forces to go to those locales. Again, look at what's happening in Sumy, Chernihiv, and other areas as well where the Russian forces could mass. So that's what we have for today. We'll have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us. As always, have a good day.